Vintage Audio Attic, Repair and Restoration. This video will show my collection of vintage audio equipment. It will also show later on in the video how I go about repairing and restoring them. You know, I'm both a collector and I'm a restorer and repairer of the equipment. I don't do this as a business. This is a hobby. But I've been interested in stereo equipment since my teen years in the 70s, and so most of my equipment, it's from around 1960 through the end of the 80s, in that range there. I really have no particular interest in brand or model, tube or solid state. As long as it's in that 30-year range, I'm probably interested in it. And I don't care personally if it's in mint condition or a rusted mess. You know, sure, I'd love to get mint condition stuff all the time, but if it's in rough shape, that's okay with me too. Many of the pieces I get, I purchase on Craigslist, local flea markets, garage sales, eBay. When I purchase something, certainly locally, I try to find out as much as I can about the history of the piece, because I find that interesting from the person I'm buying it from. Some people don't know anything about the equipment, and others have quite the story to tell about the equipment. So, you know, I've met veterans who've purchased the equipment overseas, you know, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I've met people whose husband has passed away and they had equipment, and I've also met people who've taken it to college, you know, and sometimes some of it doesn't return from college. But I love the stories behind the equipment, and really the stories I hear are sometimes they're of pride, sometimes of sadness, and you know, or humor too. So I document where I purchased the equipment, from who, the price I paid, and their story. You know, the equipment, for me, they're not museum pieces, and they don't sit under glass, and they're never touched except with white gloves. They're all out in the open, and they're all used regularly. I think I mentioned I repair the units, and later on in the video I'm going to show the equipment I use to repair and restore the equipment and talk a little bit about that. And then once I get it restored, and it's time for them to make some music, and that's what I do. Well, here we go. I'm going to start off the video, as I said, by showing some of my personal collection. Some of you will think, how can that not be his whole collection? But anyway, this is part of it. And as I said, later on in the video, I will talk about the repair and restoration of it. I'm showing my Trio tube receiver, my SX 1080, some phase linear equipment, my Marantz 10B tuner, got Marantz 2385, that's an Adcom 80, what is it, 5802 or something like that, I think. That's my 2505 Macintosh power amp. This is an SX 1250 Pioneer receiver. Below there is my Macintosh MX110 preamp tuner, and that's an MX, I think a 115 solid state version. And there's a Mac receiver down there, small Adcom amp, 535 or 45. Got a Rotel and a Marantz product. There's a Dinoco Sd, SAE 2400, some cassette decks, Sansui 1000 tube receiver, a Yamaha power amp, a Lafayette receiver, and a Kai cassette, M504 Onkyo power amp, a Dinoco ST 35, and a Sansui 9000 dB receiver. Phase linear preamp, my Marantz 2500 receiver. That's a Fisher 800C there. tube receiver, and an NAD preamp. That's my Scott 340B tube receiver. That's an AU 9900 integrated amplifier Sansui, and that's a 9600 Techniques power amp. It's a Dinoco power amp. That's my Sansui CA 2000 preamp, my TX reel-to-reel, Pioneer rack system. That's a X1000R. That's a Pioneer A27 integrated amp, Yamaha 2010 integrated amp, some Optonica equipment, tuner and integrated, a couple more Mac products, an MR65B and an MR77, my Pioneer Spec 1 and 2, Luxman receiver, 2270 Marantz, 8050 Kenwood, my cassette decks, some of them, Dragon and an MX5 Nakamichi, and there we have a M300 Luxman power amplifier, a CA5000 Sansui, and my Nakamichi digital products. You know, I bring all these in from time to time. They've all been repaired and or restored to different levels. The 2500 here has been gone from end to end. You know, and other ones like the Sakai cassette deck, you know, I put new belts in it, and then that was about it. You know, I have some higher end vintage equipment, but I have some that isn't, that I enjoy just as much, and I work on them just as hard. Here's that, I believe this is, I've got two different TX, and I think this is the 1000R. I also have just the X1000, which is the same reel-to-reel, except it doesn't have reverse. That's my Akai 220D. You know, again, I've got several open reel decks that I move in from time to time, and I'll use them a little while. Here I just moved in 3 different cassette decks. It's a Luxman, I think that middle one's a Yamaha, and there's something down below there. Oh, that's the Akai again, yeah, and there's my Nakamichi Dragon. There's below that, there's a Nakamichi LX5 cassette deck, and below that, like I say, I'll hook all these up and I'll play them a while. They need to be played. You shouldn't store them away for, you know, years. And this is my Pioneer CTF 1000, and sometimes when I'm working on things on the test bench, I'll just bring something in and just play it for a little while. You know, wasn't working on this, but brought the Mitsubishi power amp in and just hooked CD player to it. And here's my Carver. I think that's an M1.0T, and bringing him in, and I'll hook the equipment to different preamps. Here's something pretty different. That's my Dinoco ST35, small little tube amplifier that does a great job. Oh, that's the Onkyo. That's the M504. Here I have a KA3500. Then there's another Kenwood, a KA5002. This is a Pioneer SA8800. Oh, that's a Sony TA F6B. Have a Crown IC150A. And all the Crown equipment actually here. It's a nice little set that I picked up a few years ago. Nice wood case, just kind of cool. Next we have, we got a Dinoco 400. Got a Harman Kardon 16. Citation 16. And this is a Stromberg Carlson tube amp out of a console. We've got a Dinoco preamp, that's a PAZ2, and we've got a Mitsubishi preamp, and that's a DAP10. That's my Sony preamp, my TAE 901. That's an Adcom preamp tuner. That's Fisher 400, I believe. And that's a Kenwood 11 receiver. That's a Marantz 2245. And then another Marantz 2252B. And another Marantz receiver, a 2265. That's a Sansui 8080 there. That's a Sansui 8. That is a Sansui QRX 6500, I believe. Now that reel-to-reel's a GX 255 Akai. The next one's a 266D Akai. That's a GX 280D SS Akai. That's a Fostex Model 20. That's a Pioneer RT 707. And then we've got an RT 901 Pioneer. And then an RT 1011L Pioneer. That's a TAC A2300 SD. A TAC A2340, I believe. No, that's the 2340, and the other was the 23SD, I think. That's a TAC X10R. That's a TAC X1000. That is a signal processor, my Pioneer RG2. And that's a tuner, a Sansui TU717, dual 1226 turntable, a Marantz 6170 turntable, and a Technics SL D5 turntable. First, I'll talk about tape deck repair and calibration. First of all, for any piece of equipment, including a tape deck, you need the service manual. The service manual is going to give you all that information that you need to know what to adjust and when to adjust it. This picture here shows the calibration pots inside a TAC X1000R, and the service manual will have details about those. You also need equipment. You need an oscilloscope, and you need an oscilloscope pretty much to do anything with a piece of vintage audio gear. When you're setting up a tape deck, you need a Woe and Flutter meter. I mean, this will tell you how good the transport's handling the tape. So this is kind of a basic test to make sure you can go on with the rest of the testing. You also need a known starting point. And in today's world, magnetic reference laboratories make test tapes, calibration tapes. TIAC and Akai and the rest of the companies used to make them. They no longer make them. So that gives you a known starting point. And so with this, if you don't have that known starting point, you're just guessing. You know, if you try to record your own tones or whatever and try to set a deck up, it's going to be difficult at best, and probably is not going to turn out too well for you. I also have a Sound Technology 1510A tape recorder audio test system. This will do pretty much everything you need it to do with a tape recorder. You know, all those specs that are in your manual, this can check that. Again, this is a picture from the service manual showing the head block. You can align the heads with the 1510A. You know, and when, once again, you don't want to be turning these screws just kind of guessing how it should be. Again, it's probably not going to work out for you. When you get everything set up, the 1510A will test the frequency response, you know, of the deck you've set up. So really, it's a great tool. It was a great tool back, this is from the 80s, and most test benches had either this piece of equipment. There were other ones too that were very good, but this piece of equipment is almost a must when you're working on tape decks. To work on the tuner section of any vintage audio equipment, you need both the documentation, which would be the service manual, and you also need the proper equipment. The service manuals, for the most part, are available on the internet. HiFiEngine.com is a great resource for schematics and service manuals for vintage audio equipment, but you also need the proper equipment. I have a Sound Technology 1000A FM alignment generator, and it was pretty much the state of the art back in the 70s and 80s. About every test bench had it, and it'll do a great job of checking and aligning your FM. For general preamplifier or amplifier repair, you need a good multimeter or two. You also, what's very important that will really help you out, is to have good lighting. I can't emphasize that enough. I've learned that. Also, an oscilloscope is a very important basic piece for your test bench. With a scope and meters, you're well on your way. If you're working on amplifiers, some sort of a piece of test equipment that can test distortion, power output, is really a must. I use a Sound Technology 3200A. It was vintage back in the 1980s, but it's a great piece of test equipment, and it'll test most of those amplifier functions, specifications that you see in the back of your manual. Load resistors are a must for the test bench. These are 8 ohm 300 watt resistors. Modern test equipment really helps out working on the vintage audio equipment from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. You know, they're just devices that make troubleshooting much easier than it would have been years ago. Variac is important, so is a dim bulb tester. Both of those items are used so you don't damage anything when you're first powering up a new piece of equipment. Old electrolytic capacitors are the #1 cause of vintage audio equipment failure. Not only do they fail, but sometimes they can take out items that you just can't get anymore. I mean, most of the parts, fortunately, in vintage audio equipment is still available. And these electrolytic capacitors that have been in there for 30, 40, 50 or more years, you know, they've gone long beyond their rated lifespans. So the #1 thing to do with vintage audio equipment, if you want something you want to keep and have it work well for a long time, is, if you don't do nothing else, get those old electrolytic capacitors out. Visit VintageAudioAddict.com for more repair and restoration tips on your vintage audio equipment.